think it's pretty safe to say that Australians expect their government to protect the people against foreign interference when it comes to the way it comes in the way of our democracy, and impeding the way that our democracy functions. But what we don't want to see is the baby of our democracy thrown out with the bathwater. If we allow our rights to be eroded for the sake of feeling safe, we'll have nothing left to protect. I often speak of the fable of the boiling frog. If you suddenly put a frog into boiling water, it perceives its danger straight away and jumps out, and it's fine. But if you put it into cool water and slowly, gradually increase the temperature, it doesn't notice that it's being slowly cooked to death. Here in Australia, we're pretty much a generally happy little bunch of frogs, content that we're in a liberal democracy. Cane toads. You know, they've just discovered the DNA sequence of, so we might not have cane toads for too much longer, boiling water or not. But, you know, we think Australia is enlightened and we've got a generally benign political leadership, and that's not going to boil our democracy. So most of the time the water stays cool and we don't often pay attention, or at least most of us don't, to laws that are being passed that could raise the temperature and restrict our rights and freedoms. We would, of course, be likely to stand up and protest vigorously if the government tried to pass laws all at once that took all of our rights away. Of course we would. They'd be held to pay. But when the change comes incrementally, via a series of laws created in the name of national security, we might just drift on until we do boil. It's my aim, wearing my various hats as a civil libertarian, to keep people informed and draw attention to laws that do incrementally affect those rights so that we do leap out of the water as soon as it starts getting hot. And things are hotting up in this modern climate of terrorism and security fears. And our leaders are penning laws that are likely to directly affect our freedoms in the future. Some of these laws might be essential, but some do overstep the mark. It's a balancing act, and we all need to throw our weight in to protect equality, freedom and fairness under the rule of law. In the post-9/11 world, successive governments have grappled with how to keep us safe from terrorism and foreign interference, but at what cost? So what I'm going to do tonight is outline some of the threats Australia has been identified as facing in terms of foreign interference, and some of the measures the government has introduced recently to counter them thus far, and along the way discuss the human rights and civil liberties implications of those measures. And finally, we can discuss, and this is where I'd particularly like to hear from you, finding the right balance between keeping our nation secure and preserving essential freedoms and rights. So what are the threats? The two threats that are usually trotted out by governments proposing what would otherwise be considered a radical new law are terrorism and national security. On the 8th of June this year, the Australian newspaper reported that the Attorney-General, Christian Porter, was demanding the urgent passage of two separate espionage and foreign interference bills, following what he called intelligence advice of an accelerated escalation in hostile foreign activity over the past 12 months. And he linked that to the forthcoming 5 federal by-elections that were held in July 2018. The Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, in an unprecedented 400-page report containing 60 recommendations, gave the green light to the first bill, which was called the National Security Legislation Amendment, Espionage and Foreign Interference Bill 2017. And the Australians said that this would usher in unprecedented secrecy laws and significant new powers for security agencies to prosecute spies and agents of foreign powers. Now, this is the Australian talking. Unprecedented secrecy laws. The Attorney General said that the second bill, the Foreign Influence and Transparency Scheme Bill, known as FITS, if the hat fits, would expose malevolent foreign entities and agencies operating in Australia, but address concerns over press freedom and civil liberties. And I'm not sure, and the other interested agencies are not sure that they actually do have that balance right, because I don't think they do properly address concerns over press freedom or civil liberties. The Australian also reported that Porter said that both bills were necessary to address what he claimed was a current threat before those by-elections on 28th of July, and that they needed to be passed in the next sitting of Parliament to address both covert foreign disruption as well as attempts by foreign agents to influence the outcome of elections or interfere with Australia's democratic process. And while ASIO had raised a red flag on political donations before our last elections, an intelligence source said that most of the concern about recently increasing activity, including covert operations, was activity linked to the Chinese government and at levels not evident at the 2016 federal election. The AG said the level of activity has increased. The thing that this activity is designed to interfere with democratic processes, that's the view formed within government. And he said, even in the time that it has taken to consider the Espionage and Foreign Interference Bill, the threat environment has changed and become more acute. So it was rushed through in that first phase, although amendments have now, of course, been promulgated. But the committee chairman that produced this 400-page report, Liberal MP Andrew Hastie, said that the current laws prior to these bills being introduced are not adequate. He says, unchecked, espionage has the potential to significantly reduce Australia's long-term security, and foreign interference could undermine our democracy and threaten the rights and freedoms of our people. He said the committee has therefore accepted that there is a pressing need to strengthen and modernise current espionage and foreign interference laws. The new laws will also provide law enforcement and prosecutors with new tools to respond to the theft of trade secrets on behalf of foreign state actors. So, economic concerns are at the forefront as well as other concerns. The committee report did receive bipartisan support, and Labor Deputy Chairman Anthony Byrne regarding these laws as instrumental in protecting us. And he was, in fact, pushing for those to be hastened and meeting the government's demand. The FITS bill, which was vigorously opposed by media organisations, which were at risk of having to licence their staff if the companies were foreign-owned, that bill will cover individuals, organisations and companies that have direct links to foreign governments. It's going to capture any Australian or foreign company that has 15% of shares on issue held by an individual or company with links to a foreign power, or 20% of the board of directors with links to foreign governments. And the Australian reported that a source in the intelligence community said this was being referred to as the China Clause. It was clearly designed to target primarily people and entities operating in Australia with clear links to the Communist Party of China. So it's the old Reds under bed syndrome that we heard of back in the 1950s. The amendment bill will also include new transparency provisions that will allow the Secretary of the Attorney General's Department to declare companies, organisations or individuals who have hidden links to foreign governments and are involved in political activity. And the opposition spokesman on legal affairs, Mark Dreyfus, said the amendments proposed by the committee had made the Espionage and Foreign Interference Bill more effective. He confirmed that Labor would support the bill, provided that the changes set out in the committee's recommendations were agreed to by the government, together with some amendments that the ALP was suggesting. So there's another piece of legislation, the Telecommunications and Other Legislation Amendment, Assistance and Access Bill, which is known as the Encryption Bill, that I'll talk about a little bit later, has also been recently introduced. In the explanatory memorandum, it said, secure encrypted communications are increasingly being used by terrorist groups and organised criminals to avoid detection and disruption. Over 90% of telecommunications information being lawfully intercepted by the AFP now uses some form of encryption. Malicious actors increasingly communicate through secure messaging applications, social media, and VoIP services. The increasing use of encryption has significantly degraded law enforcement and intelligence agencies' ability to access communications and collect intelligence, conduct investigations into organised crime, terrorism, smuggling, sexual exploitation of children and other crimes, including foreign interference, and detect intrusions into Australian computer networks. Encryption can conceal the content of communications and data held on devices, as well as the identity of users. Encryption is a global issue, with major technology providers headquartered overseas and communications travelling across national boundaries, adding to the challenges that encryption requires, and it requires, of course, international cooperation. So these are some of the recent measures government has made in response to these perceived threats. And so I'll discuss them in a little bit more detail. In terms of the tranche of foreign interference legislation, New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties worked with other state and territory civil liberties organisations across Australia throughout January and February this year to respond to this huge tranche of legislation. The legislative package relating to national security and foreign intervention includes those two pieces of legislation that I've just referred to, as well as the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Bill, the Security of Critical Infrastructure Bill, and the Home Affairs and Integrity Agencies Legislation Amendment Bill. While these bills were touted as being important tools to protect Australia against foreign interference in the interests of national security, their implications are far broader. What they amount to is an extraordinary, multifaceted attack on civil society's right to participate in public political discourse. Their combined effect is a massive expansion of national secrecy laws, capturing not only public officials but also any person who makes an unauthorised disclosure of information covered by these laws. Journalists have rightly protested that the secrecy laws effectively criminalise pretty much every phase of their work if it happens to come into play. Charities and independent advocacy bodies like GetUp believe that they have been specifically and deliberately targeted in order to undermine their participation in public political discourse. It will affect their ability to do their work because it's perceived that they might have connections internationally. But whether or not the laws were deliberately targeting them is beside the point. The impact on them is real. Many of the offences carry very serious penalties indeed. In the case of general secrecy offences, it's going to double the maximum penalties. It is going to criminalise ordinary activity and bring with it a real clout in terms of penalty. Our then Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, rightly described this package as the most important overhaul of our counterintelligence legislative framework since the 1970s. It was therefore an utter disgrace that the public was only given a few weeks to comment on them. Strong protests from civil society groups eventually did gain an extension into February 2018. And it was shortly after that that the committee met and came up with this large report proposing amendments. But the fact is that few organisations were able to respond to all the bills in that time frame because it was a huge amount of work. And when you've got a small organisation like the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties, which is run entirely by volunteers, apart from one part-time policy person, it's impossible to respond to serious changes to our laws in that kind of time frame. The reaction from civil society and the media and the Law Council of Australia has been ferocious, to put it mildly. The Attorney General, Christian Porter, responded with that package of amendments. Submissions are due on those amendments next week, I think it is, and many bodies are just not going to have time to respond to that. Now that's not proper consultation. If you want to get good laws, you need to have good consultation, because the unintended consequences of laws can only be detected at this time. And once it's made law, it's so hard to wind it back and pull it back. But having said that, the proposed amendments were a smart and positive move by the Attorney General, and they are generally in line with the recommendations made by the civil liberties organisations and the Law Council. But they're still a long way from solving the very significant problems with these bills. And the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties and other organisations like the Law Council are going to do what they can to persuade the Parliament not to pass these bills, and certainly not in their current form. But Elaine Pearson, the Australian Director of Human Rights Watch, made some really good comments on this, and I'm just going to refer to a few of them. She said, authoritarian governments around the world use broadly drafted national security laws to silence human rights defenders, journalists, bloggers and critics of the government. Australia should not join them by passing a revised espionage and foreign interference law that excludes safeguards for legitimate disclosures in the public interest. So I think she's absolutely right. You know, prejudice to national security is drafted really broadly, and things like there's got to be a degree of damage that comes with that for it to amount to prejudice to national security. Embarrassment alone shouldn't be enough. But it's not just journalists who are going to fall afoul of these laws. So might whistleblowers. Think of Edward Snowden. Individuals, non-government organisations who expose human rights violations will all fall foul of these amendments.
Right.
Indeed. The human rights activists would be at particular risk. They publish or share sensitive information with international bodies like the United Nations, for instance. The Council for Civil Liberties among them. We're a registered observer of the UN. So if we share any information about that, we might be falling foul of it and find ourselves committing a criminal offence. Look, it is obviously, I don't think anybody doubts that it's in the public interest for the government to have some confidentiality and secrets. It's a no-brainer. But it's all about striking the right balance and not preventing legitimate discourse while you're protecting those sorts of secrets and sensitive information. Nobody should ever be prosecuted for exposing human rights violations.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
What about leaking government information about airstrikes that killed civilians? And those sorts of things. There should always be a public interest defence, and that is lacking in this legislation. While the Attorney General has a discretion to prosecute, that's not going to be enough. So even if we as Australians think that our courts are robust enough to withstand this, it's putting too much faith in that executive branch.
They're as corrupt as all hell.
Well, indeed, that even if they were not corrupt, I mean, we're seeing some of that. We're seeing some of that.
They control through process.
Yeah.
Which is what they're doing here, which is what you're talking about. Yeah?
Precisely right. And what I'm worried about is that Australia here is setting a worldwide precedent, in a sense, for liberal democracy, certainly. And while we don't have a Human Rights Act in Australia,
Yes.
The potential for this to do real
They
harm
can do
is
anything
extraordinary.
they want,
They
and you can do nothing about it.
And the courts have no way of coming back on these things because we don't have a Human Rights Act or a Charter of Rights, a Bill of Rights to measure legislation against. Elaine Pearson pointed out that we see these sorts of things happening already in China and Russia. And of course, protecting Australia from governments like China and Russia is what this legislation is actually about. And yet we're becoming more like them to protect ourselves from them. It's absurd.
Well, it doesn't happen here, it does happen.
That's mad as hell.
Yeah. So many covert activities in Australia by foreign governments will be difficult to prosecute under the new law. And what I think would be wise for us to do if we want to make it possible to really protect ourselves from the actual harm is to set up a national monitor to receive and investigate complaints from communities that have struggled with getting police to act on their complaints about what's happening in Australia. You've got immigrants coming to Australia afraid of the Australian authorities leaking things about them to foreign governments. Ethiopian people, Chinese people in particular have expressed concerns about this. Freedom of expression, a lot is being said about that in the media at the moment and by the conservative end of politics. And it's something that we do almost take for granted, but you don't want to have these powers to curtail foreign interference, criminalise the actions of legitimate people. And the Law Council of Australia in its submission has made it's a hugely detailed submission, and I don't propose to go into it, but I recommend that you have a look at it. It's on their website, so have a look. They're really concerned that the bill is not going to be effective in achieving its stated aim of providing transparency for the Australian government and Australian public about the forms and sources of foreign influence in Australia. Clearly, the majority of foreign influence in Australia is actually benign. It's the malicious intent that it should be striving to curb, but we've got real concerns that it's going to, in fact, cover everything. So, I'm going to talk quickly about the Telecommunications and Other Legislation Amendment Assistance and Access Bill 2018. It's become known as the Encryption Bill. And this new legislation is going to change the landscape for law enforcement and surveillance companies. Despite its significance, about 200 pages of draft legislation was introduced with very little public consultation. An exposure draft was released to key stakeholders, including the Law Council of Australia and the Council for Civil Liberties, on a confidential basis with only 2 weeks to respond. I'm sorry, that is not proper consultation. This response period closed last week, and on Monday this week, with unseemly haste, without sufficient time for the submissions to be fully digested, I challenge anyone to fully digest those sorts of concerns. The bill passed through the Coalition Party room to be introduced to Parliament. This bill comes following the metadata retention legislation introduced a few years ago. You'll remember that, when government promised us, was at pains to emphasise that the compulsory retention of data would be restricted to metadata only, that the content of messages would be protected. It was sacrosanct. It was just the time, the date, the place, to whom, from whom, the metadata that was going to be available. And this was to reassure us that there would be no overreach and that our human rights and freedoms would not be impinged. Yet here we are, only a short time later, and the new Encryption Bill proposes that the content of our private communications be made accessible.
Shame!
Typically, as you know, content of electronic communications is encrypted, it's encoded. What this legislation does is provide that communications and technology companies be required to decrypt messages to make the content of our private communications accessible to law enforcement authorities and others. And so there's a graduated system of directives that can be given under the legislation, ranging from voluntary to mandatory. Make no mistake about it, these are radical proposals. The New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties made a submission jointly with other civil liberties organisations and industry organisations. Government should be on notice that industry is alarmed and opposed to this proposed legislation too. It's not just the typical lefty bleeding hearts, as the right tries to call us, who are alarmed by this. It's industry. There is significant value, of course, and I think we all accept this, to public safety and allowing law enforcement authorities to gain faster and more efficient access to encrypted information where there really are threats to national security or in order to prevent the commission of a serious criminal offence. I think we get that. And we also would say that there's merit in facilitating prompt international cooperation and assistance to deal with cyber crimes if they're occurring across multiple jurisdictions. But what we need to find is a balance, because this doesn't include proper safeguards and controls. It means that technology firms and communications firms will be required by law to tell the authorities what our private communications say. They go far beyond the rationale for operation of the proposed enhanced powers. According to the Department, the Exposure Draft Bill, the Encryption Bill, has been developed to address threats by terrorists, child sex offenders, criminal organisations who use encryption and other forms of electronic protection to mask illegal conduct, including by foreign powers. But the fact is that every piece of communications, benign or not, is effectively encoded. It's a binary data, and it's often encrypted well beyond that. So to say that because things are encrypted means that they're inherently suspicious is just simply wrong. It's going to introduce new computer access warrants for law enforcement that will enable agencies and authorities to covertly obtain evidence directly from a device. So you won't even know that your telephone's being monitored. You won't know that your emails are being read. So there are real concerns about protection of individual privacy and accountability and oversight. And I'm not going to go into too much detail because I want to leave time for us to have a discussion, but every interference in the fundamental human right to privacy should be considered and weighed against any perceived imperative to protect society from threats and to protect the personal safety of individuals. We really do need to do this to ensure that an appropriate balance is struck when the opening of by decryption or removal of password protection of an otherwise encrypted or protected communication. So that's not an arbitrary thing. There's got to be an objective test and an objective sense that a crime has been or is in imminent danger of being committed. So we need to protect that fundamental human right to privacy and weigh it against the expansion of the purposes that are used to carve out exceptions to the prohibition on access to communications. The power to request or require decryption doesn't displace the need for an agency to obtain lawful authority to view the content. And so this is what's being told to us. by the department and by the drafters of the legislation, but it's not express in the bill, and that's a real concern. This limitation is fundamental in determining whether the Encryption Bill undermines security and confidentiality of a really wide range of communications. It would include financial transactions flowing through the international banking system, or whether, on the other hand, it is an unreasonable interference in the fundamental human rights of privacy. There needs to be, in my view, judicial oversight of that process. So a judge should be made to consider that there is a real crime being committed and that there is a reasonable chance that something is imminent and about to be enacted before it happens. Thanks.
That would be a warrant, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, yes, like a warrant, similar process to a warrant, but certainly judicial oversight to make sure that there actually really is a crime about to be committed or being committed. Anyway, so I'll go through to another little piece of interesting proposal that's coming through from government at the moment. It's in relation to facial recognition and social monitoring. I don't know how many of you watched Foreign Correspondents on the ABC earlier this week when the social credit system in China was being discussed. It was pretty concerning. In the name of creating a safer society and the enhancement of national security, facial recognition, coupled with other technology, is being rolled out across China and linked together in an unprecedented way so that the most minute of day-to-day movements of all citizens can be monitored.
600 million cameras.
Yeah. It enables the Chinese government to create a system of what they call social credit, whereby those who behave well, you eat well, so it looks at what you put in your trolley in the shopping in the supermarket. Avoid bad habits, make sure you don't order too much grog on the internet. Exercise sufficiently. Mind that your Fitbit on your watch doesn't give away your lazy traits and lack of exercise. If you don't pay your bills on time, then they'll access the credit ratings, and that all gets fed into this social credit system. So that if you have a high social credit rating, then you get rewards. You get cheap hotel deals, easy access to loans, access to employment prospects and the like, while those with a low social credit score...
Everyone in this room, that is.
Well, that's exactly right, because if you gather in places like this, for meetings like this, it will be added to your social credit rating. Deducted. Discredit points. And those with the low social credit score will be subject to virtual home detention because their credit cards will get cut off. Their access to social media will be restricted. Family will be blacklisted, so they can't get access to education and those sorts of things if that person is seen as acting against the interests of the government.
That's deep state shit.
It really is. And at worst, disappearances are being reported, especially in the Uyghur provinces.
Yeah.
If this sounds too much like science fiction, or that nothing like this would be contemplated in a fabulous liberal democracy like Australia, well, think again. COAG has agreed to the establishment of a national facial biometric matching capability, which will have access to all drivers' licences in Australia, as well as visa, passport and citizenship photos. This massive biometric database will be available to state and federal security and law enforcement agencies. The rationale for this very significant increase in the capacity for real-time government surveillance of most Australian residents is, of course, to better protect ourselves. We do, of course, want governments to do all that's reasonable and proportionate to protect us. And as part of that, We'd support effective coordination between states and federal agencies. But the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties, the Law Council of Australia and others fear that this development in mass surveillance capacity will, over time, have really significant implications that are not currently appreciated for the nature of our society and the robustness of our democracy. These are going to have real impact on our privacy and other liberties that we've traditionally held dear. These impacts are acknowledged but are seen by our political leaders as a necessary price to pay for safety and for national security.
Sell out.
We could potentially take greater comfort in their assurance that they'll simultaneously be maintaining robust privacy safeguards if they showed a greater appreciation of and concern for the associated risks and the likely implications of this increased capacity for state surveillance on us as citizens. At this stage, there's little detail about how this increased surveillance capacity will work and what will be done to protect this massive trove of our personal biometric data from hacking or misuse, whether by our own agencies or by foreign powers. So there was a joint media release issued last year by a number of agencies that just basically said a comprehensive national face database is simply incompatible with a free society. So,
It gets you fingerprint at the airport, and you do it over to your at the airport.
yeah. And as a lawyer, I've had my irises scanned to get in to see clients at the jails. So for me, I'm already there. So they'll have access to all of that, and couple that with facial recognition and other data accessibility proposed by the other bills that I've referred to today. Think how my privacy is going to be impacted. And I don't think that Stephen Blanks, the president of the Council for Civil Liberties, said the community does not yet understand the real implications of facial recognition technology and how fundamentally the way people can access public spaces like airports, sporting facilities and shopping centres will change. When they understand the realities of this technology, people will be very concerned. But at the moment, there's not enough being said about it. This was introduced it was first talked about in October last year. And despite the media release that was issued by ourselves, by the chair of the Australian Privacy Foundation, chair of Digital Rights Watch, vice president of the Queensland Council for Civil Liberties, executive officer of Electronic Frontiers Australia, he bemoaned that the proposal amounted to nothing less than a complete betrayal of a fundamental civil liberty of all Australians. If implemented, it will ensure that the presumption of innocence no longer has any effective meaning in this country. Such an untargeted mass surveillance database is just the latest attempt by governments to categorise everyone as potential suspects, not citizens. The organisations involved called on all Australians concerned about this initiative to contact both their state and territory and federal parliamentarians to help them understand that this initiative is an example of government overreach that is simply unacceptable. I join them in that call here today among you. Make your feelings known to your member. It's such a fundamental encroachment.
Totally unacceptable.
But if you do it electronically, it's one more bad mark on your record.
It is. Your social credit goes right down. So how do we find the right balance between keeping our nation secure and preserving essential human rights and freedoms? We do want governance to protect us, but we have to guard against the tendency of power by its very nature to draw to itself ever more and more power. Government's actions must not only be necessary for our protection and national security, they must also be proportionate to the threat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
An effective coordination between states and federal agencies, that's not a bad idea. to use the already existing enormous powers that they have.
Exactly.
That will keep us safe.
Yeah.
We don't need these laws to keep us safe. What's feared is that crackdowns in the name of securing us against foreign interference and the associated development in mass surveillance capacity will over time have those really significant implications for the fundamental nature of our society. Those in power just don't seem to be getting that. We've got to make them see. And their seemingly untroubled endorsement of these new and radical laws, our political leaders have blithely dismissed any concerns about the admitted, and they do admit the impact on privacy and other liberties. If the loss of these is the price to pay for safety and national security, then what will we have left to protect? It's been acknowledged since ancient Rome that to enable the amassing of power in the hands of few leads to the destruction of democracy. So we must remain vigilant against this threat. And I don't pretend to have all the answers as to how to strike the right balance between national security and the protection of our liberties and freedoms and rights. But let's ensure that we don't boil the frog of our precious democracy. Anyway, so we can have some questions and answers after.